The summer of 1987 hung heavy over rural Oregon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the gravel roads and turned the fields golden brown before their time. In the small farming community of Timber Creek, population barely breaking 300, everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. The Henderson farm sat at the edge of town, a modest property with a white clapboard house that had seen better days and a red barn that leaned slightly to the east as if tired from decades of standing against the wind. Martha Henderson had lived there for 43 years, ever since she married Robert Henderson in 1944, right after he came back from the war. Robert had been gone for 12 years now, taken by a heart attack while fixing the fence line. And Martha had managed on her own with a stubbornness that was equal parts admirable and concerning to her neighbors. She was 72 that summer. With silver hair she kept in a practical bun, and hands that were still strong despite the arthritis that had begun to settle into her knuckles. She wore the same style of cotton house dresses she had worn for decades, faded florals in blues and greens, and she kept her small house immaculate despite living alone. The kitchen always smelled of coffee and whatever pie she had baking, usually apple from the trees in her backyard. She attended the Methodist church every Sunday without fail, sitting in the third pew on the left, the same seat she had occupied since 1944. After services, she would chat with the other ladies about the weather, the crops, and whose children were doing what, but she never stayed long. She valued her independence and her privacy, and she had her routines. The one disruption to her solitary life had come 3 years earlier when her nephew Daniel showed up at her door with a duffel bag and a story about needing a fresh start. Daniel Morrison was Martha's younger sister's boy, and he had always been what people politely called troubled. He was 31 when he arrived in Timber Creek, tall and thin, with sandy hair that he wore too long, and a way of not quite meeting your eyes when he talked to you. He had drifted through various jobs and various towns, leaving behind a string of broken relationships and unpaid debts. His mother, Martha's sister Ellen, had died 2 years before that, and there was nobody else left in the family who would take him in. Martha, with her strong sense of family duty and her Christian charity, had opened her door to him. Daniel moved into the small room above the garage, a space that had once been Robert's workshop but had been converted into rough living quarters. It had a bed, a hot plate, a small table and chair, and not much else. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until Daniel got on his feet, but temporary had stretched into months and then into years. He picked up odd jobs around the area, farm work mostly, but nothing steady. He would work for a few weeks and then disappear for days, and Martha never asked where he went because she was afraid of the answers. But he was family, and in Martha's world, that meant something. It meant everything. To the people of Timber Creek, Daniel seemed harmless enough, if a bit odd. He kept to himself mostly, walking into town to buy cigarettes and cheap beer at the general store, occasionally showing up at the diner for breakfast. He drove an old Ford pickup truck, primer gray with rust eating through the wheel wells, and it was often seen parked in front of Martha's house, or sometimes out on the back roads where people went when they wanted to be alone. Some of the church ladies worried about Martha having him there, wondered if it was proper, wondered if she was safe. But Martha would hear none of it. He was her sister's boy, she would say, and he had nowhere else to go. Besides, he helped around the property, fixed things that needed fixing, and kept her company. She was doing her Christian duty, and that was the end of it. The relationship between Martha and Daniel was more complicated than most people realized. In the beginning, during those first few months after he arrived in 1984, things had gone relatively well. Daniel had seemed genuinely grateful for the chance Martha was giving him. He had painted the garage, fixed the front porch steps, cleaned out the gutters. He found work at a neighboring farm during harvest season and came home tired but seemingly content. Martha had allowed herself to hope that maybe this time would be different for him, that maybe the stability and the quiet of Timber Creek would give him what he needed to finally get his life together. She remembered him as a boy, before everything went wrong, and she wanted to believe that boy was still in there somewhere. But as the months turned into years, the cracks began to show. Daniel's periods of employment grew shorter, and the gaps between jobs grew longer. He started drinking more, staying out later, coming home angry about things he would not explain. The money Martha had initially given him to help him get started never seemed to be enough. There were always more expenses, more emergencies, more reasons why he needed just a little bit more to tide him over. Martha's modest savings, carefully accumulated over decades of frugal living, began to dwindle. She never talked about it with anyone, too proud and too protective of family privacy, but the strain showed in her face, in the tired lines around her eyes, in the way she seemed to shrink a little more each month. The argument started sometime in the second year. Neighbors would hear raised voices late at night, Daniel's angry and demanding, Martha's trying to be firm but wavering. The next morning, Martha would appear at church or in town with her usual composure, as if nothing had happened. But people noticed. They noticed the way she flinched at sudden noises. They noticed how she seemed to be checking over her shoulder. They noticed the new lock on her bedroom door, visible through the window when someone stopped by with a casserole or a jar of preserves. But when anyone asked if everything was all right, Martha would smile that practiced smile and say everything was fine, just fine, and change the subject so smoothly that it felt rude to press further. The truth was that Martha had begun to fear her nephew, though she would never have admitted it out loud, perhaps not even to herself. She had seen the rage in his eyes during their arguments, the way his hands would clench into fists, the way he would loom over her, using his height and his youth to intimidate. He had never actually hit her, not quite, but there had been moments when she thought he might, when she had backed away and locked herself in her room until he calmed down or passed out or left. She told herself it was the drinking, that if he could just stay sober, he would be the good boy she remembered. She told herself she was doing the right thing by standing by him, that family did not give up on family, that this was what Ellen would have wanted her to do. She told herself a lot of things to make it bearable. What Martha did not know, what she could not have known, was that Daniel's troubles went far deeper than unemployment and drinking. He had gotten involved with people in the regional drug scene, small-time dealers and users who operated out of the rural areas where law enforcement was spread thin and everyone minded their own business. He had started using methamphetamine, which explained his increasingly erratic behavior, his paranoia, his violent mood swings. He owed money to dangerous people, more money than he could ever hope to repay with odd jobs and handouts from his elderly aunt. The pressure was building. And Daniel was not the kind of person who handled pressure well. In the months leading up to that October, several people had approached Martha with concerns. Pastor Reynolds had pulled her aside after services one Sunday and gently suggested that perhaps Daniel needed professional help, that there were programs for people with substance abuse problems. Martha had thanked him stiffly and said she would think about it, but she never did. Betty Pritchard, her closest friend, had been more direct, telling Martha over coffee that she was worried, that Daniel seemed dangerous, that Martha should consider asking him to leave. Martha had gotten angry then, something she rarely did, and told Betty that she did not understand, that it was easy to judge when it was not your family, that she had made a promise to her sister to look after Daniel and she intended to keep it. The two women had not spoken for weeks after that. Carl Masterson, the neighbor down the road, had his own concerns but approached them differently. He started paying closer attention to the comings and goings at the Henderson place. He noted the times Daniel's truck roared past his property late at night, going too fast on the gravel roads. He saw the strange cars that sometimes showed up, people he did not recognize who would meet with Daniel in the driveway or down by the barn, conversations that looked tense and transactions that looked suspicious. Carl had thought about calling the sheriff more than once, but he had no proof of anything illegal, just suspicions, and he knew how Martha would react if he got her nephew in trouble. So he watched and worried and told himself he would intervene if things got truly bad, not realizing that by the time things got truly bad, it would be far too late. The last week of September brought a change in the weather. The heat finally broke, and the nights turned cool. The leaves on the cottonwood trees along the creek began to show hints of gold. School had been back in session for a month, and the rhythm of the farming year was winding down toward winter. Martha seemed lighter somehow during that week, as if some burden had been lifted. She was more talkative at church, more present. She worked in her garden with renewed energy, putting the beds to rest for the winter, collecting the last of the tomatoes and zucchini. Several people remarked on how well she looked, how it was nice to see her smiling again. Nobody knew that Daniel had been gone for most of that week, off somewhere doing something he had not explained, and that Martha had been luxuriating in the peace of having her home to herself again. Daniel returned on Thursday night, and the peace shattered. Carl Masterson heard the truck come roaring up the road around 10 o'clock, much too fast, the engine screaming. He heard it skid into the Henderson driveway, heard a door slam, heard shouting. He went to his window and looked out across the dark fields toward the Henderson place. He could see lights on in the house, could see shadows moving behind the curtains. The shouting continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Then it stopped abruptly, and the lights went out, and everything was quiet. Carl stood at his window for a long time after that, feeling uneasy but not knowing what to do. Finally, he went to bed, telling himself it was not his business, that couples argued, that it would blow over like it always did. He did not know that Martha and Daniel were not a couple, and he did not know that this time it would not blow over. Friday dawned clear and cool, a beautiful autumn morning. The mailman made his rounds at his usual time, arriving at the Henderson place around 2 in the afternoon. He saw Martha in the garden, kneeling by the rose bushes with her clippers, deadheading the last blooms before winter. He called out a greeting, and she waved back, smiling. She looked perfectly normal, perfectly fine. The mailman put the mail in the box, waved again, and drove on. He would later testify that this was approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, and that Martha had appeared healthy and in good spirits. He was the last person, other than Daniel, to see her alive. What happened in the hours after the mailman left, nobody knows for certain. There were no witnesses, no surveillance cameras, no neighbors close enough to hear or see. Whatever occurred happened behind the closed doors and drawn curtains of that white clapboard house, between an elderly woman and her troubled nephew, and only one of them lived to tell the tale, and he chose not to tell it. The prosecution would later construct a timeline based on evidence and logic, but it was ultimately speculation, an attempt to impose narrative order on a moment of chaos and violence that defied orderly explanation. What is known is this: at some point on Friday evening or night, Martha Henderson died. She died violently, losing a massive amount of blood. The blood spatter patterns analyzed later would suggest she was struck multiple times, probably with fists or a blunt object. She may have fought back, or she may have been too shocked or too frail to resist effectively. She died in her own home, the place where she had lived for 43 years, where she had raised no children, but had created a life of quiet dignity and routine. She died at the hands of someone she had tried to help, someone she had sheltered and fed and forgiven again and again because he was family, and family mattered. After Martha was dead, Daniel faced a choice. He could have called for help, claimed it was an accident or self-defense, taken his chances with the law. He could have confessed, shown remorse, accepted responsibility. Instead, he chose to run. He wrapped Martha's body in something, probably the quilt from her bed or a tarp from the garage, and carried her out to his truck. She was a small woman, not much over 100 pounds, and he was a strong man despite his vices, so it would not have been difficult. He put her in the truck bed, covering her with more tarps or blankets, and then he went back into the house. What happened next showed a degree of calculation that would later disturb everyone who heard about it. Daniel cleaned. He was not thorough enough, not nearly thorough enough to defeat modern forensic science, but he tried. He wiped down surfaces, he mopped the floors, he washed bloody clothing in Martha's washing machine. He took the clothes out of the dryer and packed them in a garbage bag. He went through the house collecting anything that might be his, anything that connected him to this place. He took Martha's purse and rifled through it, taking the small amount of cash she kept there. He might have been looking for more, for bank cards or checkbooks or jewelry, but if he found anything, he took it with him. Then Daniel drove away from the Henderson place for the last time. It was probably very late Friday night or early Saturday morning, that dark hour before dawn when the world is at its quietest. He drove out of Timber Creek heading south, probably on Highway 97, the long empty road that cuts through eastern Oregon toward California. He drove with his aunt's body in the back of his truck, past sleeping towns and dark forests and fields gray with dew. Somewhere along that journey, he stopped and disposed of Martha's body. Where exactly remains unknown. The prosecution theorized that it was somewhere in the Cascade Mountains, that vast wilderness area between Oregon and California where thousands of acres of forest could hide anything forever. Search teams would later comb those areas, walking grid patterns, looking for disturbed earth or the marks of recent digging. But the mountains are immense, and the forests are thick, and Martha stayed hidden. By Saturday afternoon, Daniel was in Northern California, still driving, maybe not even knowing where he was going, just going. He stopped for gas and paid with cash. He stopped at a liquor store and bought beer and whiskey. He drove back roads, avoiding towns, avoiding people. The story he would later tell, about leaving after an argument, about Martha being alive when he left, was clearly fabricated, but it was the story he stuck to. Maybe he had convinced himself it was true, rewritten his own memories to make himself less of a monster. Or maybe he simply did not care, figured he was caught anyway, so why make it easier for them? When the state trooper found him at that rest stop on Interstate 5, Daniel had been on the run for nearly a week. He was dirty and unshaven, his clothes stained, his truck reeking of cigarettes and alcohol, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that the trooper noticed but could not quite identify. Daniel seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the running had exhausted him more than any punishment could. Or maybe that was just projection, people wanting to believe he felt some guilt, some remorse. The reality was probably simpler and darker. He was tired and drunk and out of money and out of options. The investigation that followed Daniel's arrest was meticulous. Sheriff Brennan and his team, assisted by state police forensic experts, processed every inch of Daniel's truck. They found blood in quantities that shocked even seasoned investigators. It was under the seats, soaked into the floor mats, sprayed in fine droplets on the ceiling and the inside of the windshield. The pattern told a story of violence, of someone bleeding badly while in or near the truck. The shovel in the truck bed had soil on it, and forensic botanists analyzed the soil composition, trying to determine where it came from. But the results were inconclusive, matching dozens of possible locations across 3 states. They processed the Henderson house too, going over it inch by inch with luminol and alternate light sources. They found blood traces despite Daniel's cleaning efforts. Blood in the living room carpet, blood on the wall near the fireplace, blood in the grout of the bathroom tile where Daniel had tried to wash it away. There was not as much as in the truck, suggesting that whatever happened had happened quickly and that Daniel had gotten Martha out of the house before she bled too much. Or perhaps she had bled primarily in the truck, injured but not yet dead when he moved her. It was impossible to know for certain. The DNA analysis was the definitive evidence. In 1987, DNA profiling was still relatively new to criminal justice, though the science had been around for a few years. The technique, developed by Alec Jeffreys in England in 1984, had been used in a handful of criminal cases, but this was one of the first times it would be deployed in a rural Oregon murder investigation. The state crime lab extracted DNA from the blood samples collected from the truck and compared it to DNA extracted from Martha's hairbrush and toothbrush, items taken from her bathroom. The samples matched across all the genetic markers they tested. The probability of the blood being anyone other than Martha was calculated as something like 1 in several billion. It was, for all practical purposes, certain. The trial was held in the county courthouse, a dignified old building with high ceilings and dark wood paneling. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney James Whitmore, a man in his 50s with a reputation for being thorough and merciless. He had never lost a murder case, and he did not intend to start now. His opponent was Sarah Chen, the public defender, who looked young enough to be his daughter and who was completely overmatched. She did her best, and in fairness to her, there was not much anyone could have done with the case she had been given. Daniel was guilty, the evidence overwhelming, and his own behavior had destroyed any possibility of sympathy. Whitmore's opening statement laid out the case with brutal clarity. Martha Henderson had been a good woman who had opened her home and her heart to her nephew. Daniel Morrison had taken advantage of her kindness, had drained her resources, and when she finally stood up to him or cut him off, he had killed her in a rage. He had then disposed of her body with calculated callousness and fled the state. The evidence would show, Whitmore said, that Daniel's truck was essentially a mobile crime scene, soaked with Martha's blood. The evidence would show that Daniel had lied repeatedly about his whereabouts and his actions. The evidence would show that Daniel Morrison was a murderer who deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. Sarah Chen's opening statement focused on reasonable doubt. She reminded the jury that no body had been found, that there was no crime scene, no witness to any violence. She suggested that the blood in the truck might have an innocent explanation, though she could not articulate what that explanation might be. She pointed out that Daniel had no history of violence against Martha, that witnesses would testify he had seemed to care about his aunt. It was thin, and everyone in the courtroom knew it, but it was all she had to work with. The prosecution's witness list was extensive and damning. They called neighbors who testified about the arguments between Martha and Daniel, about the raised voices and the tension that had hung over the Henderson property. They called the mailman who had seen Martha on Friday afternoon, establishing that she was alive and well at that time. The prosecution's witness list was extensive and damning. They called neighbors who testified about the arguments between Martha and Daniel, about the raised voices and the tension that had hung over the Henderson property. They called the mailman who had seen Martha on Friday afternoon, establishing that she was alive and well at that time. They called friends from church who testified about Martha's character, about her kindness and her generosity, painting a picture of a saintly woman destroyed by an ungrateful nephew. They called Carl Masterson, who testified about hearing the argument Thursday night, about seeing Daniel's truck speeding on the roads late at night, about the general atmosphere of unease that had surrounded the Henderson place. Then came the forensic witnesses, and this was where the case became truly overwhelming. The lead crime scene technician walked the jury through the processing of Daniel's truck, showing photographs of the bloodstains before and after luminol treatment. The images were shocking even to people who had expected them, the truck interior glowing brilliant blue under the black light, every surface contaminated with blood. A forensic pathologist testified about the quantity of blood found and what it indicated about the severity of the victim's injuries. He explained that a person could not lose that much blood and survive, that whoever had bled in that truck was certainly dead. The DNA expert was a scientist from the state crime lab, a precise woman named Dr. Linda Yamamoto, who had a gift for explaining complex science in terms a lay jury could understand. She walked them through the process of DNA extraction and analysis, comparing it to a highly specific fingerprint that existed in every cell of a person's body. She explained how she had created DNA profiles from the blood samples and from Martha's personal items, and how those profiles matched. She showed them autoradiographs, those strange X-ray-like images with their pattern of dark bands, and explained how the bands from the blood samples lined up exactly with the bands from Martha's reference samples. She testified that in her professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, the blood in Daniel Morrison's truck was Martha Henderson's blood. The defense tried to challenge the DNA evidence, suggesting it was too new and untested to be reliable. But this argument gained no traction. DNA evidence had already been accepted in courts across the country, and Dr. Yamamoto's credentials and methodology were impeccable. Sarah Chen tried to suggest the possibility of contamination or sample switching, but she could not point to any specific instance where this might have occurred, and the chain of custody documentation was thorough and well maintained. The DNA evidence stood, unshaken and unshakable. As the trial progressed, the mood in Timber Creek grew increasingly bitter toward Daniel. People who had previously felt some measure of pity for him, who had seen him as more pathetic than dangerous, now saw him as a monster. The details coming out in testimony, the cold-blooded disposal of Martha's body, the methodical cleaning of the crime scene, the lies and the flight, all painted a picture of someone beyond redemption. There were calls for the death penalty, though Oregon had no death penalty at the time, having abolished it in 1984. People had to settle for hoping he would get the maximum sentence and never see freedom again. The defense case was brief, lasting only 2 days compared to the prosecution's 3 weeks. Sarah Chen called a few character witnesses who testified that Daniel had not seemed violent, that he had been polite and quiet in their interactions with him. She called a psychologist who suggested that Daniel might have been suffering from untreated mental illness or substance abuse issues that could have impaired his judgment. None of it made much impact. The jury had seen the photographs of the blood-soaked truck. They had heard Dr. Yamamoto's testimony about the DNA match. They had heard the witnesses describe Martha's fear and Daniel's anger. They had made up their minds. Daniel did not testify, as was his right. Sarah Chen had advised against it, knowing that Whitmore would eviscerate him on cross-examination. There was no good answer Daniel could give to the central question, if you did not kill your aunt, how did her blood end up all over your truck? Daniel had no answer, or at least no answer that anyone would believe, so he remained silent. He sat at the defense table throughout the trial, expressionless, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but mostly just staring at nothing. Some people thought he looked haunted. Others thought he looked bored. It was hard to read anything from his blank face. Closing arguments were dramatic and emotional. Whitmore gave a passionate speech about justice for Martha, about the betrayal of trust, about the need to hold Daniel accountable for his terrible crime. He reminded the jury that while Martha's body had not been found, the evidence of her death was overwhelming and indisputable. He told them that Martha deserved justice, that the community deserved justice, that they had the power to deliver that justice through their verdict. Sarah Chen's closing argument was more subdued, asking the jury to remember the high burden of proof required in a criminal trial, to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt. But her heart did not seem to be in it, and the jury could tell. The jury got the case on a Thursday afternoon. They deliberated through the rest of Thursday and all day Friday, sequestered in a hotel overnight. There was some tension during deliberations, one or two jurors who initially wanted to hold out, troubled by the lack of a body or by lingering doubts about the DNA evidence. But the evidence was too strong, and eventually everyone came around. On Saturday morning, they sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, packed to capacity with spectators, reporters, and Martha's friends who had attended every day of the trial. Daniel was brought in from the holding cell, wearing the same ill-fitting suit he had worn throughout the trial. Judge Margaret Thornton took the bench, and the jury filed in. The verdict was guilty on all counts: murder in the second degree, abuse of a corpse, and theft. The courtroom erupted in applause and crying. Several of Martha's friends had to be escorted out, overcome with emotion. Judge Thornton called for order, thanked the jury for their service, and scheduled sentencing for 4 weeks later. Daniel showed no reaction. He simply stood when instructed, sat when instructed, and was led away when instructed. Whatever was going on inside his head remained locked away where no one could reach it. The sentencing hearing was heavily attended but less emotionally charged than the verdict. By then, everyone knew what was coming. Several of Martha's friends gave victim impact statements, talking about what a wonderful person she had been, how much she was missed, how her death had left a hole in the community. They spoke about the gardens she had tended, the pies she had baked for church socials, the quiet kindness she had shown to everyone. They spoke about the betrayal of Daniel's crime, about how she had tried to help him and he had destroyed her. Daniel listened to all this without visible emotion, his face as blank as it had been throughout the trial. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel stood and, for the second time in the entire legal process, he broke his silence. His statement was brief and, to many in the courtroom, infuriating in its lack of remorse. He said he did not kill his Aunt Martha. He said he did not know what happened to her. He said he hoped the truth would come out someday. He said he was sorry for the pain everyone was feeling, but that he was not responsible for causing it. Then he sat down. It was exactly the wrong thing to say, showing no accountability, no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of his crime. If he had been hoping to influence the judge toward leniency, he had failed spectacularly. Judge Thornton gave a lengthy statement before imposing sentence. She talked about the nature of the crime, about the vulnerability of elderly victims, about the special betrayal involved when a family member commits violence against someone who trusted them. She noted Daniel's lack of remorse, his refusal to tell authorities where Martha's body was located, denying the family even the small comfort of a proper burial. She said that Daniel's crime was not just against Martha, but against the entire community, destroying their sense of safety and trust. Then she imposed sentence: 25 years to life in state prison, with a recommendation that parole be denied. Daniel would be 57 years old before he could even apply for parole, and given the nature of his crime and his lack of remorse, it seemed unlikely he would ever be released. Daniel was transported to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, a maximum security facility that housed some of the state's most dangerous criminals. For the first few years, he kept to himself, working in the prison laundry, avoiding trouble. He filed appeals, challenging his conviction on various grounds, but they were all denied. The DNA evidence was solid. The trial had been fair. The verdict was supported by the evidence. There was no basis for overturning the conviction. Eventually, Daniel seemed to accept this. The appeals stopped, and he settled into the routine of prison life. Something changed in Daniel during those years in prison, or at least something appeared to change. He got his high school equivalency diploma through the prison education program. He took college courses through a partnership between the prison and a local community college, eventually earning an associate's degree in liberal arts. He read extensively, working his way through the prison library's collection of classics and philosophy. He attended the prison's AA meetings, standing up and admitting he was an alcoholic, talking about the damage his drinking had done. He participated in anger management classes and cognitive behavioral therapy. On paper, he looked like a model of rehabilitation. But there was something hollow about it, something that felt performative rather than genuine. Daniel never wavered from his claim of innocence. He never told authorities where Martha's body was. He never showed the kind of deep, soul-level remorse that would indicate true understanding of what he had done. Prison counselors and social workers who worked with him noted this in their reports. He was going through the motions of rehabilitation without ever really engaging with his crime. It was as if he had decided that maintaining his innocence was more important than anything else, even if it meant spending the rest of his life in prison. Outside the prison walls, life went on. Timber Creek slowly recovered from the trauma of Martha's murder. The Henderson property changed hands several times over the years. The white clapboard house was renovated and modernized. The barn that had leaned to the east was finally demolished and replaced with a modern garage. The garden where Martha had spent so many peaceful hours was redesigned into a contemporary landscape. The physical traces of Martha's life were erased, but the memory persisted. The church still had photographs of her in the fellowship hall. The older residents still told stories about her kindness and her tragic end. She became part of the town's history, a cautionary tale and a memorial both. Sheriff Brennan retired in 1995, 8 years after Martha's murder. It remained the biggest case of his career, the one he was asked about in retirement, the one that stayed with him. He never stopped hoping that someday Martha's body would be found, that her friends could have closure, but as the years passed, that hope faded. The case file remained open, technically, but there were no new leads, no new evidence, nothing to pursue. Other cases came and went, other crimes demanded attention, and Martha Henderson became a cold case, unsolved in the sense that her body was never recovered, even though everyone knew who killed her and he was serving a life sentence for it. The prosecutor, James Whitmore, became a judge in 1992 and served on the county bench for 20 years. He considered the Morrison trial one of the most important of his career, not because it was particularly difficult, but because of what it represented about the power of DNA evidence to bring killers to justice. He spoke about the case at legal seminars, using it as an example of how circumstantial evidence and forensic science could overcome the lack of a body or an eyewitness. The case became part of legal textbooks, cited in law schools across the country as an example of a successful prosecution without a body. Sarah Chen left criminal defense work after the Morrison trial. It had been her first major case, and the loss had been devastating, even though there was probably nothing she could have done differently with the hand she was dealt. She moved into family law, helping people with divorces and custody disputes, work that felt less emotionally draining and morally ambiguous. She tried not to think about Daniel Morrison, but sometimes late at night she would wonder if she had done enough, if there was some argument or strategy she had missed that might have changed the outcome. Rationally, she knew the answer was no, but doubt lingered. Dr. Linda Yamamoto, the DNA expert, went on to testify in hundreds of cases over the following decades as DNA evidence became increasingly central to criminal investigations. The Morrison case was one of her first high-profile trials, and she always remembered it fondly because the jury had really listened and understood the science. As DNA technology improved over the years, becoming faster and more precise, she sometimes thought about that case and how groundbreaking it had seemed at the time. Now DNA evidence was routine, expected, and the kind of analysis that had taken weeks in 1987 could be done in hours. Progress marched on, but some cases stayed with you. The people of Timber Creek who had known Martha grew older. Some died, taking their memories of her with them. The generations turned over, and new families moved to town who had never known Martha Henderson and barely knew the story of her murder except as local legend. The church where Martha had worshipped every Sunday for 43 years underwent renovations. The fellowship hall was updated, and some of the old photographs came down, including Martha's. She was fading from living memory into history, as all people eventually do. Daniel Morrison continued to serve his sentence. In 2013, he became eligible for parole, having served the minimum 25 years. He appeared before the parole board with his attorney, a different lawyer than the one who had represented him at trial. He had a good institutional record, no serious disciplinary infractions, evidence of education, and self-improvement. But when asked about his crime, he continued to maintain his innocence. He said he did not kill Martha Henderson. He said he did not know where her body was. He said he had been wrongly convicted. The parole board deliberated for less than an hour before denying parole. They noted his lack of remorse, his refusal to accept responsibility, his continued denial of a crime for which the evidence of guilt was overwhelming. Parole denied. Come back in 5 years. This pattern repeated in 2018 and again in 2023. Each time, Daniel appeared before the board. Each time, he maintained his innocence. Each time, parole was denied. He was now 67 years old, his hair white, his face lined with age and imprisonment. He had spent nearly 40 years in prison for Martha's murder, more years incarcerated than he had lived as a free adult before his arrest. He would likely die in prison unless he changed his story, and he showed no signs of changing his story. Whether this was principle or stubbornness or genuine innocence was impossible to say, and perhaps it did not matter anymore. The outcome was the same either way. In Timber Creek, almost nobody remembered Daniel Morrison anymore. The people who had testified at his trial were mostly dead or had moved away. The courthouse where he was convicted had been renovated twice. The newspaper that had covered his trial had gone out of business, replaced by online news sources that had no institutional memory and no archived articles from 1987. The Henderson property had been sold again, this time to a developer who subdivided it into 3 lots and built modern houses that bore no resemblance to the white clapboard farmhouse where Martha had lived and died. Every physical trace of that life and that tragedy had been erased. But in the Oregon State Penitentiary, Daniel Morrison remained, an aging man in a small cell, maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen, which was almost nobody. He still read voraciously, spending hours in the prison library, losing himself in books because the present was unbearable and the future was non-existent. He had become one of those long-term prisoners who seemed more ghost than human, moving through the routines with mechanical precision but no real engagement. The other inmates mostly left him alone. He was old, he was quiet, and he had nothing they wanted. Sometimes Daniel thought about that October in 1987, trying to remember exactly what had happened. But the memories were slippery, distorted by time and trauma, and possibly by chemicals he had put in his body during those years. He remembered arguing with Martha about money. He remembered her face, tired and disappointed. He remembered rage, white-hot and overwhelming, the kind of rage that came from years of failure and frustration and self-hatred finding a target. After that, the memories fragmented into disconnected images that might have been real or might have been nightmares he had had so many times they felt like memories. Blood on his hands. Martha's body, small and broken. The weight of her as he carried her to the truck. The long drive south with panic rising in his throat. the shovel biting into rocky soil somewhere in the mountains, though he could not remember where, could never remember where, no matter how many times they asked him. Or maybe none of it was real. Maybe it had happened differently. Maybe Martha had fallen, hit her head, and he had panicked and run because he knew how it would look. Knew his history, knew nobody would believe it was an accident. Maybe someone else had hurt Martha and he had found her and fled because he was a coward. Maybe the DNA evidence was wrong somehow, contaminated or mislabeled, and he really was innocent. He had told himself all these stories over the years, trying them on like different suits of clothes, but none of them fit quite right. The truth was somewhere in his head, locked away where even he could not reach it, protected by defense mechanisms and denial and the sheer impossibility of living with what he might have done. The one thing Daniel knew with certainty was that he could not tell them where Martha's body was, because he genuinely did not remember. That night was a blur of adrenaline and fear and intoxication. He had driven for hours, pulled off onto Forest Service roads, carried Martha's body into the woods, and dug. But where? The mountains all looked the same, thousands of acres of dense forest and steep terrain. He had been in no state to note landmarks or remember the route. He had just driven until exhaustion overtook panic, then done what needed to be done and driven away. Even if he wanted to lead them to Martha's grave, wanted to give her friends that small comfort, he could not. The location was gone, erased from his memory as surely as if it had never existed. This was perhaps the greatest torture of his imprisonment, greater even than the loss of freedom or the aging in a cage or the knowledge that he would die here. He carried the secret of Martha's location inside him, but it was a secret even he could not access. It made his protestations of innocence ring hollow, made people think he was being deliberately cruel by withholding information when the truth was that the information was simply gone. But how could he explain that? How could he make anyone understand that you could do something terrible and then lose the memory of the most crucial details? They would think he was lying or faking or playing games. So he said nothing, or he said he was innocent, and either way the result was the same. In 2025, 38 years after Martha's murder, something unexpected happened. A group of hikers in the Cascade Mountains, about 60 miles south of Timber Creek, stumbled across something while exploring off-trail. They found bones, scattered by animals but clearly human, along with scraps of what might have been fabric or a quilt, degraded almost to nothing by decades of exposure. They called the authorities and a recovery team was dispatched. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the state medical examiner's office in Portland. The forensic anthropologist who examined the remains determined they were female, elderly, and had been in the woods for several decades. The bones showed signs of trauma consistent with blunt force impact. Dental records were consulted, and within 2 weeks, the identification was confirmed through dental comparison and DNA analysis. The remains were those of Martha Henderson. After 38 years, she had finally been found. The news made headlines across Oregon and beyond. The Martha Henderson case, which had faded into history, was suddenly current again. Television news crews descended on Timber Creek, interviewing the few remaining residents who remembered Martha. The story of the caring aunt and the nephew who betrayed her was retold for a new generation. Old newspaper articles were digitized and republished. The case became the subject of true crime podcasts and documentary specials. Martha Henderson, who had lived such a quiet, private life, became famous in death in a way she never would have wanted. The discovery brought a measure of closure to the few people who still remembered Martha personally. Her remains were returned to Timber Creek and buried in the cemetery beside her husband, Robert, finally at rest after decades of lying in the cold mountain forest. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of elderly people who had known her, and a much larger number of curiosity seekers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Pastor Reynolds, who had tried to warn Martha about Daniel all those years ago, was long dead, but the current pastor spoke about forgiveness and peace and the hope of resurrection. It felt inadequate to the moment, but then what words could adequate? The location where Martha's remains were found was analyzed by forensic experts and compared to Daniel's known movements in October 1987. The location matched the general area where he could have gone based on gas station receipts and the truck's fuel capacity. It seemed to confirm what everyone had always believed, that Daniel had killed Martha and disposed of her body during his flight to California. The case was officially closed, marked as solved, and filed away. There would be no new trial, no additional charges. Daniel was already serving a life sentence. The discovery of Martha's remains changed nothing for him legally, but it might have changed everything for him personally. Prison officials informed Daniel that Martha's body had been found. He was sitting in his cell when the chaplain came to tell him, sitting on his narrow bunk reading a book he had read a dozen times before because the prison library had limited selection and he had read everything else. The chaplain sat down beside him and explained that hikers had found remains in the mountains, that they had been identified as Martha Henderson, that she had finally been found after all these years. Daniel listened without expression, then nodded and thanked the chaplain for telling him. After the chaplain left, Daniel sat for a long time holding his book but not reading, staring at the wall, processing this information. Part of him felt relief. The weight of Martha's unknown location, of carrying that terrible secret, had been crushing him for decades, even if he could not consciously access the memory. Now it was known. Now she could be buried properly. Her friends could have closure. That was good. That was right, even if it confirmed his guilt in ways that made his claims of innocence even more impossible to maintain. Another part of him felt despair, because this was the final nail in the coffin of any hope he might have had for vindication. As long as Martha's body was unfound, there was some tiny theoretical possibility of an alternative explanation. Now, even that was gone. That night, alone in his cell in the dark, Daniel Morrison cried for the first time since his arrest. He cried for Martha, for the woman who had tried to help him and gotten destroyed for her kindness. He cried for himself, for the life he had wasted, for the man he might have been if things had gone differently. He cried for his mother Ellen, who had loved him despite everything, and who would have been heartbroken to see what he had become. He cried because he was 68 years old and had spent 40 years in prison and would die here without ever being free again. He cried because somewhere deep inside, beneath all the denial and the self-deception and the protective layers of rationalization, he knew he had killed Martha Henderson, and that knowledge was finally too heavy to carry alone in silence. The next morning, Daniel requested a meeting with the prison chaplain. When they met, Daniel said he wanted to talk, really talk, for the first time in 38 years. He said he was ready to tell the truth, or at least the truth as much as he could remember it. The chaplain listened as Daniel spoke haltingly about that October night, about the argument with Martha over money, about the rage that had consumed him, about his hands around her throat, or maybe striking her. The memory was unclear on the exact mechanics, but clear on the intent and the outcome. He spoke about the panic afterward, about wrapping her body and putting it in the truck, about driving blindly into the mountains and finding a remote spot and digging a grave in the dark. He spoke about the years of denial, about how he had convinced himself that maybe it had not happened the way he remembered, that maybe he was innocent, because the alternative was too terrible to live with. The chaplain asked if Daniel wanted to make a formal statement to authorities, if he wanted to finally take responsibility publicly. Daniel thought about it for a long time before answering. He said he did not know what good it would do now. Martha was dead and buried. He was already serving a life sentence. The people who had loved Martha were mostly dead themselves. What purpose would a confession serve except to give satisfaction to people who already knew he was guilty? The chaplain said it might give him peace, might ease the burden on his soul. Daniel laughed bitterly at that and said he was pretty sure his soul was beyond easing, but he would think about it. Daniel did think about it for days and then weeks. He thought about the concept of redemption, whether it was possible for someone like him who had done what he had done. He thought about Martha and whether she would want him to confess or whether she would have forgiven him already, being the kind of woman she was. He thought about his own death, which could not be many years away now, and what he wanted his final accounting to be. In the end, he decided that confession would be a selfish act, seeking absolution for himself rather than serving any higher purpose. His guilt was established. His punishment was ongoing. His remorse, such as it was, could remain between him and whatever God might exist. He would serve out his sentence and die in prison, and that would be the end of it. But something had changed in Daniel after that conversation with the chaplain. The rigid insistence on innocence fell away. When he appeared before the parole board in 2028, at age 72, for what would be his last parole hearing, he spoke differently than he had at previous hearings. He did not claim innocence. He acknowledged that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that the jury had reached the correct verdict. He said he had spent decades in denial because facing what he had done was too painful, but that the discovery of Martha's remains had forced him to confront reality. He said he was deeply sorry for what he had done, for the pain he had caused, for the waste of Martha's life and his own. He said he understood if the board denied parole again, that he deserved to remain in prison, but that he wanted them to know he finally accepted responsibility for his actions. The parole board members listened carefully. They questioned him extensively, probing to determine if this acceptance of responsibility was genuine or just another manipulation. Daniel answered their questions honestly, or as honestly as he was capable of after decades of self-deception and denial. He admitted he could not explain exactly why he had killed Martha, that it was a combination of anger and frustration and substances and mental illness, but that none of those things excused what he had done. He said he thought about Martha every day, about her kindness and her patience, and how he had repaid her goodness with violence. He said if he could undo it, he would, but since he could not, all he could do was live with it and try to find some small way to make meaning out of the terrible thing he had done. The parole board deliberated for 3 hours, longer than they had ever deliberated on Daniel's previous applications. In the end, they voted to deny parole again, but it was a split vote rather than unanimous. And they reduced the time before his next hearing from 5 years to 3 years. It was not freedom, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that his change might be real, that redemption might be possible even for someone who had committed such a terrible betrayal. Daniel received the news without visible emotion, simply nodding and thanking the board for their consideration. He was led back to his cell to continue his sentence, but something in his posture seemed lighter, as if the weight he had been carrying for 38 years had finally eased, at least a little. In Timber Creek, almost nobody paid attention to Daniel Morrison's parole hearing. The few people who remembered the case felt he should never be released and were satisfied that he had been denied again. The discovery of Martha's remains had brought the case back into public consciousness briefly, but attention had moved on to newer tragedies, fresher scandals. The Henderson property, now divided into 3 separate lots with 3 modern houses, was home to families who had never heard of Martha Henderson and had no idea that she had been murdered on the land where their children played. The past was truly past, remembered by fewer and fewer people with each passing year. But in a filing cabinet in the county courthouse, the file on State of Oregon versus Daniel Morrison remained, thick with decades of documents and photographs and transcripts. The DNA reports that had been so revolutionary in 1987 looked almost quaint now, using techniques that had been superseded multiple times by newer and more precise methods. The photographs of the crime scene, of Daniel's truck glowing under ultraviolet light, of the blood spatter patterns, were fading with age, the colors shifting and the images degrading despite being stored in archival conditions. Paper was not permanent, and even the most carefully preserved records eventually decayed into illegibility. But the story endured, passed down through court records and legal textbooks and true crime media, a story about trust and betrayal, about family obligation and its limits, about how DNA evidence revolutionized criminal justice, about how even the quietest lives could end in violence, about how some questions could never be fully answered no matter how much evidence existed. The case of Martha Henderson and Daniel Morrison had become mythology, simplified and flattened in the retelling, reduced to archetypes and lessons and cautionary tales. The messy reality of who Martha and Daniel actually were as complex human beings, with their own histories and traumas and choices, was mostly lost, remembered now only in the fading memories of a few elderly people who had known them personally. Daniel Morrison continued to age in the Oregon State Penitentiary. His hair went completely white. His eyesight failed, requiring thick glasses that the prison provided. His joints ached with arthritis, making the simple act of walking painful. He developed diabetes and high blood pressure, chronic conditions that were managed with medication but never cured. He was one of thousands of aging inmates in American prisons, men who had committed crimes in their youth or middle age and were now growing old and sick behind bars, costing the state enormous sums to house and provide medical care for, serving sentences that extended far beyond any reasonable hope of rehabilitation or public safety benefit. But the laws were the laws, and Daniel had been sentenced to 25 years to life, and life was turning out to be very long indeed. In his cell at night, Daniel sometimes thought about what his life might have been if he had made different choices, if he had not started drinking so young, not gotten involved with drugs, not given in to his worst impulses, if he had gotten help for his mental health issues instead of self-medicating, if he had found steady work and a stable relationship and a normal life, if he had never shown up at Martha's door in 1984 with his duffel bag and his problems. The alternate versions of his life seemed impossibly distant, as if they had happened to someone else or had never happened at all, as if the man he might have been was a complete stranger to the man he had become. He thought about Martha, too, wondering what she would think if she could see him now, an old man in a prison cell, finally admitting what he had done, finally accepting responsibility. Would she forgive him? She had been a religious woman, a believing Christian who took seriously the commandments to forgive those who trespassed against you. But there were limits to forgiveness, surely. Some things were too terrible to forgive. Murder, especially of someone who had loved you and tried to help you, seemed like it should be beyond the possibility of forgiveness. And yet Martha had been the kind of person who would have tried to forgive even that if she could. Daniel found this thought almost unbearable, the idea that Martha might have forgiven him when he could never forgive himself. The years passed with the grinding slowness of institutional time. 2029 became 2030, became 2031. Daniel marked his 75th birthday in his cell, celebrated with a cupcake from the commissary that another inmate had given him. He had outlived most of the people who had been involved in his case. Sheriff Brennan had died in 2019. Judge Thornton had passed away in 2021. The prosecutor James Whitmore died in 2023. Dr. Yamamoto, the DNA expert, was still alive but retired, spending her days gardening and playing with her grandchildren, rarely thinking about the hundreds of cases she had worked on over her career. Sarah Chen, his defense attorney, had moved to California and was now a family court judge herself. Having risen far beyond the overwhelmed young public defender she had been at his trial. Of the principals in the case, only Daniel remained, an aging relic of a crime from another era. The world outside the prison had changed beyond recognition. Technology had advanced in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1987. DNA analysis that had taken weeks in the state crime lab could now be done in hours with portable equipment. The internet had revolutionized everything about how people communicated and accessed information. The small farming community of Timber Creek had been absorbed into the expanding suburbs of the regional urban center, its population now over 5,000, its character completely transformed from the place Martha had known. In 2031, Daniel Morrison applied for parole for the 6th time. He was 75 years old, had served 44 years in prison, and his health was failing rapidly. His diabetes was poorly controlled despite medication. He had suffered a minor stroke the previous year that left his left hand weak and clumsy. He walked with a cane now, slowly and carefully, an old man who posed no conceivable threat to public safety. His attorney, a different one than Sarah Chen, argued that continued incarceration served no purpose, that Daniel was not the same person who had committed the crime, that he had served more than enough time, that compassionate release was appropriate given his age and health status. The parole board heard from Daniel, who spoke briefly and without drama. He said he had accepted responsibility for Martha's death. He said he had spent decades trying to become a better person, though he knew that did not erase what he had done. He said he did not expect forgiveness, but hoped for mercy. He said he would like to spend whatever time he had left as a free man, though he understood if the board felt that was not appropriate. He did not beg or plead or make grand promises. He simply stated his position and waited for their decision. This time, after 44 years, the parole board voted to grant parole. The vote was not unanimous, and it came with strict conditions. Daniel would be required to wear an electronic monitor. He would have to report regularly to a parole officer. He would be prohibited from leaving the state. He would be required to attend counseling and continue his medical treatment. Any violation of these conditions would result in immediate return to prison. But, subject to those conditions, Daniel Morrison would be released from the Oregon State Penitentiary after spending more than 4 decades behind bars. The decision was controversial. When news of the parole grant became public, there was immediate backlash. Crime victims' rights groups protested, arguing that someone convicted of such a heinous crime should never be released. The few remaining people in Timber Creek who remembered Martha were outraged, feeling that justice was being betrayed. There were calls for the governor to intervene and block the release, though the governor had no legal authority to do so. Local television stations ran stories about the case, interviewing people who were angry about the decision. For a few weeks, the 44-year-old murder case was current news again. But the legal process moved forward regardless of public opinion. Daniel was scheduled for release in 60 days, time to arrange for housing and medical care and the other practical necessities of re-entering society after 4 decades in prison. A halfway house agreed to take him, a facility that specialized in elderly parolees who needed medical support. Social workers helped him apply for Social Security and Medicare benefits. A nonprofit that worked with long-term prisoners helped him obtain identification documents and opened a bank account for him. The machinery of re-entry, clunky and underfunded but functional, ground slowly into motion. On a cold morning in March 2032, Daniel Morrison walked out of the Oregon State Penitentiary as a free man for the first time since 1987. He was 76 years old, white-haired and frail, wearing donated clothes that did not quite fit and carrying a small bag containing his few possessions. A social worker was there to meet him and drive him to the halfway house. There were no reporters, no crowds, no drama. It was an unremarkable moment, an old man walking out of a building, notable only to those who understood the decades of suffering and punishment and slow transformation that preceded it. The world Daniel emerged into was unrecognizable from the one he had left. Everything had changed, from the cars to the technology to the social norms to the physical landscape. The halfway house was in a suburb that had not existed when he was arrested. The social worker handed him a smartphone and tried to explain how to use it, but it was overwhelming. Incomprehensible. How could a phone not have buttons? How could you touch a picture and have it take you somewhere else? It was like learning a foreign language, one where he did not even recognize the alphabet. Daniel spent his first weeks of freedom in a fog of confusion and adjustment. The halfway house was clean and well run, but it was still institutional, still constrained by rules and schedules and requirements. He had to wear the electronic monitoring ankle bracelet at all times. He had to report to his parole officer twice a week. He had to attend counseling sessions where a therapist half his age asked him questions about his feelings and his plans for the future. The entire experience felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else's life rather than living his own. But gradually, very gradually, something like peace began to settle over him. He walked in a nearby park, slowly and with his cane, enjoying the simple act of being outside without guards or fences. He sat in a coffee shop, overwhelmed by the number of options, but eventually managing to order a simple black coffee, and marveled at being able to sit and drink it without anyone telling him when to leave. He went to a grocery store and nearly had a panic attack at the sheer abundance of choices, the bright lights, the crowds of people, but he managed to buy bread and cheese and fruit and felt a small sense of accomplishment at this basic task. He thought about Martha often during those early days of freedom. He wished he could tell her that he had finally taken responsibility, that he had changed, that he was trying to make what remained of his life mean something. He knew she could not hear him, that she was gone, but sometimes he spoke to her anyway, in his mind or in whispers when he was alone. He told her he was sorry, over and over, knowing the words were inadequate but having no better ones. He told her he hoped she was at peace, wherever she was. He told her he would try to honor her memory by being better than he had been, by helping others if he could, by not wasting the chance he had been given. Daniel volunteered at a local food bank, one of the few places that would accept a volunteer with his criminal record. He sorted donations, stocked shelves, helped distribute meals to homeless and low-income families. The work was simple and physical, and it gave him a sense of purpose, a way to contribute something positive after having caused so much pain. The other volunteers knew he was on parole, but did not know the details of his crime, and he did not volunteer the information. He was just Daniel, an old man who showed up reliably and worked quietly and never complained. One day while volunteering, he met a woman named Rose, another elderly volunteer who had recently lost her husband. They struck up a conversation while boxing canned goods, talking about nothing important, just the small talk that fills comfortable silences. Rose was kind and lonely, missing her husband but trying to find purpose in her remaining years. Over subsequent weeks, they talked more, developing a friendship built on their shared experience of loss and their desire to be useful in whatever time remained to them. Rose did not know about Daniel's past, and Daniel did not tell her, unsure how to explain or whether he had any right to friendship given what he had done. But eventually, because secrets have a way of emerging and because honesty seemed like the only path forward, Daniel told Rose who he was and what he had done. He expected her to leave, to be horrified, to want nothing more to do with him. Instead, she listened quietly, asked a few questions, and then said simply that everyone had a past, and that what mattered was who he was now. It was an act of grace that Daniel had not expected and did not feel he deserved, but he accepted it gratefully, and their friendship continued. Daniel Morrison lived for 3 more years after his release from prison. They were quiet years, unremarkable years, spent volunteering and attending his required appointments and slowly rebuilding some small version of a life. He never returned to Timber Creek, knowing he would not be welcome there. He never sought publicity or attention, content to live in obscurity. He maintained his relationship with Rose, who became his closest friend and the only person in the world who knew his full story and accepted him anyway. In the fall of 2034, Daniel's health took a turn for the worse. The diabetes had caused kidney damage, and his doctors recommended dialysis, but Daniel declined. He was 80 years old and had lived far longer than he had any right to expect. He was tired, bone-tired, tired in a way that no amount of rest could address. He made the decision to enter hospice care, to let nature take its course, to die with whatever dignity remained available to him. Rose visited him regularly during those final weeks, sitting beside his bed in the hospice facility, reading to him when he was too weak to read for himself, holding his hand when the pain was bad. Daniel was grateful for her presence, for this final act of human kindness in a life that had contained little of it. As his body failed and his mind began to drift in and out of consciousness, he thought about Martha, hoped that somewhere, somehow, she knew he was sorry, knew he had tried to change, knew he had not completely wasted the years after her death. Daniel Morrison died on an October evening in 2034, 47 years almost to the day after Martha Henderson disappeared. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the full story, though few people did. There was no obituary in the newspaper, there was no funeral beyond a brief graveside service attended only by Rose and the hospice chaplain. He was buried in a county cemetery, his grave marked with a simple stone bearing only his name and dates. In death as in life, he remained unremarkable. Just another old man who had died after a long and largely wasted life. The story of Martha Henderson and Daniel Morrison did not end with Daniel's death, because stories never really end as long as someone remembers to tell them. The case remained in legal textbooks, still cited as an example of early DNA evidence and successful prosecution without a body. True crime podcasts occasionally revisited it, drawn by the elements of family betrayal and forensic science. Criminology students wrote papers analyzing the investigation and the trial. The story endured, simplified, and mythologized. The real people reduced to characters in a narrative about justice and evidence and the price of betrayal. In Timber Creek, or what had once been Timber Creek before being absorbed into suburban sprawl, almost nobody remembered Martha Henderson anymore. The church where she had worshipped every Sunday had been demolished and replaced with a commercial development. The cemetery where she was finally buried beside her husband Robert was still maintained, but visitors were rare. The land where her house had stood bore no trace of her life or her death, completely transformed by development and time. But somewhere in the files and databases of the Oregon criminal justice system, the complete record remained. The case file, the trial transcripts, the evidence logs, the DNA reports, the parole hearing records, all preserved in digital form now, theoretically imperishable, though dependent on changing technologies and continued institutional maintenance. Future researchers could, if they wanted, reconstruct the complete story of what happened in rural Oregon in 1987, when an elderly woman took in her troubled nephew and paid for that kindness with her life. The story raised questions that had no easy answers. Questions about family obligation and when it became enabling. Questions about mental illness and substance abuse and personal responsibility. Questions about redemption and whether someone who had committed such a terrible act could ever truly change or be forgiven. Questions about justice and punishment, and whether 44 years in prison constituted appropriate consequences or excessive cruelty. Different people would answer those questions differently, based on their own values and experiences and philosophies. There were no objectively correct answers, just perspectives and opinions, and the messy reality of human complexity that resisted simple categorization. What remained certain, what could not be debated or reinterpreted, was that Martha Henderson had lived and died, that she had been a real person with hopes and fears and routines and relationships, and that her life had been cut short by violence. She deserved to be remembered for more than just her death, for the kindness she had shown and the community she had been part of, and the quiet dignity with which she had lived. But memory is selective, and time is relentless, and eventually even the best remembered lives fade into footnotes and database entries, and the occasional mention in academic papers. The DNA evidence that convicted Daniel Morrison represented a revolution in criminal justice, a scientific tool that could identify perpetrators with unprecedented certainty. In the decades since Martha's murder, DNA evidence had solved thousands of cases, exonerated hundreds of wrongly convicted people, and fundamentally changed how crimes were investigated and prosecuted. The Henderson case was a small but significant part of that revolution, an early demonstration of the technology's potential. In that sense, Martha's death had contributed, however unwillingly, to a greater good, to a system of justice that was more accurate and more reliable than what had existed before. But all the scientific progress and legal precedents could not change the fundamental tragedy at the heart of the story, the human cost that could never be recovered or compensated. An elderly woman had been murdered by someone she had tried to help. A life had been wasted in prison, whatever small redemption Daniel might have achieved in his final years. Families had been destroyed, communities had been traumatized, and ripples of pain had spread outward in ways that could never be fully traced or measured. Justice had been served, in the sense that the guilty party had been identified and punished, but justice was cold comfort compared to the warmth of lives lived and loves shared and years that should have been but never were. And so the story ends, not with resolution or closure or any clean conclusion, but with the messy reality of time passing and people dying and stories fading into history. Martha Henderson and Daniel Morrison, the elderly aunt and the troubled nephew, the victim and the killer, the betrayed and the betrayer, existed now only in records and memories and the occasional retelling of their story. Their lives had intersected briefly and destructively in rural Oregon in 1987, and the consequences of that intersection had echoed for decades. Now even the echoes were fading, soon to be silent, until all that remained was data in a database and a cautionary tale told to illustrate points about DNA evidence or family dynamics or the nature of justice. That is how all stories end eventually, dissolving into forgetfulness, remembered imperfectly if remembered at all, until finally even the memory of memory fades and nothing remains but silence.